Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Timothy Marbun, and on behalf of the team, I would like to welcome you to the launch of World Bank Indonesia newest report, Indonesia Economic Prospects 2020, The Long Road to Recovery. It is an honor to host the launch and also to lead the discussion today in our event. We plan the event to go continue until 10:30 in the morning, Jakarta time. And in addition to the remarks from the World Bank Country Director for Indonesia and Timor-Leste, Ibu Satu Kakonen, and also remarks from Australian Ambassador to Indonesia, Ambassador Gary Quinlan, we will also hear a keynote speech from Indonesia's Coordinating Minister of Economic Affairs, Bapak Airlangga Hartarto. Then we will hear the lead economist for World Bank Indonesia, Federico Gil Sanders, who will join us and deliver the presentation on the report today on Indonesia latest economic update. I will then moderate a discussion between Indonesia Finance Minister Ibu Sri Mulyani Indrawati and also Ibu Mari Elka Pangestu, World Bank Managing Director of Development Policy and Partnerships, who will be joining us all the way from the United States. Now, if you have any questions during our panel discussion, you can scan the QR code or choose the option Ask Question on your screen. You will then be connected to Slido to submit your questions. The options of using Indonesian or English are also available on your screen. Now, for the media, there will be a press conference immediately after the event, but you will need to be registered as media. Therefore, please choose press conference option on your screen to join in the press conference. We invite you to follow the World Bank Indonesia Twitter account @BankDunia, and please use the hashtag #IEPBankDunia for the conversation in social media and join our talks there. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we will start our event today. And to start, we will hear remarks from World Bank Country Director for Indonesia and Timor-Leste, Ibu Satu Kakonen. Ibu Satu, the screen is yours.
Selamat pagi dan selamat datang, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you all to our first virtual launch of the Indonesia Economic Prospects. This biannual report succeeds the Indonesia Economic Quarterly as the flagship report of the World Bank Indonesia office. And as we start, I would like to acknowledge our distinguished guests. Her Excellency, Ibu Sri Mulyani Indrawati, the Minister of Finance of Indonesia, His Excellency, Mr. Gary Quinlan, Australia's Ambassador to Australia, and Ibu Mari Pangestu, Managing Director for Development Policy and Partnerships in the World Bank. I would also like to thank Australia's Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade for their support for this publication and for the analytical work of the World Bank overall in Indonesia. Now, the COVID-19 pandemic has disrupted billions of lives around the world and also jeopardized decades of development progress. We have never seen global lockdown of this magnitude. The World Bank is now forecasting a 5.2% economic contraction in global GDP in this year. And this is the deepest global recession since the Second World War and almost 3 times as steep as the 2018 global recession. Advanced economies, emerging markets, and developing economies are all affected, with deepest economic contractions forecasted to take place in advanced economies. The growth in East Asia and the Pacific region is projected to slow sharply to 0.5% in 2020, from almost 6% in 2019. And most countries have had to impose lockdown measures to contain the pandemic. And differences in timing, duration, and stringency of these measures have influenced the declines of GDPs across the countries. Also, economic disruptions have been most severe in countries with large domestic breakouts and those that rely heavily on global trade, tourism, commodity exports, and external financing. In the case of Indonesia, we forecast Indonesia's economic growth to decline to 0% in 2020. It is important to note that this forecast, this 0% growth forecast, is predicated on three things. First, the global economy contracting by 5.2% in this year. Second, Indonesia's economy fully reopening in August. And third, there being no second wave of infections. If any of these assumptions change, then the forecast will also change. And my colleague, Frederica Gil-Sander, will go into more details on Indonesia's recent economic developments and economic outlook. Now, as always, crisis offers both challenges and opportunities. And now is the time to take the advantage of the opportunity to rebuild the country and rebuild the country better by advancing key reforms. And we see three reform priorities in building a better road to recovery in Indonesia. The first priority, in our view, is the removal of restrictions to investment and business through the Omnibus Bill. To accelerate economic recovery, to attract investors, and to make Indonesia competitive, improving investment climate is essential. By removing heavy restrictions on investment, the Omnibus Bill would be the first step toward an overhaul of Indonesia's investment regulatory framework. Its adoption would signal to the world that Indonesia is open to business. But before its adoption, it is critical to modify those parts of the bill that, unless altered, would harm Indonesia's natural environment. The second reform priority would be to reform state-owned enterprises to boost infrastructure investment. Indonesia faces a very large infrastructure gap. It amounts to $1.6 trillion US, and this is constraining economic development of the country. The gap is so big that it cannot be closed solely with public funds. But Indonesia will need to mobilize more private financing. State-owned enterprises have been central to the delivery of infrastructure, but they have also crowded out the private sector. Also, government's fiscal limits have forced many state-owned enterprises to turn to debt financing, and as a result, some SOEs are now in financial distress. Therefore, reforming state-owned enterprises to catalyze private sector participation in infrastructure will be the key to boosting infrastructure investment. Then thirdly, the third reform priority in our view is to accelerate tax policy reforms to finance recovery. The economic downturn and the support packages that have translated into rising public debt trajectory. This hinders spending on development priorities such as health, education, and social protection that are much needed, and that also is threatening Indonesia's hard-earned credit rating. Therefore, tax reforms to raise revenues will be of paramount importance to enable the much-needed public spending and to flatten the debt curve. No country in the world has been able to reach the high-income status with the tax-to-GDP ratio in single digits. And to learn more about how Indonesia can tackle and can address these reforms, I'm delighted that we will have a policy conversation today with Ibu Sri Mulyani and with Ibu Mari. I'm so happy that they are joining this show this morning. And I hope that you will also enjoy this session. The World Bank is committed to support the government in tackling these unprecedented threats that are posed by the COVID-19 pandemic. And we stand ready to support and help the government with the design of policies and responses that save lives, protect the poor and vulnerable, and accelerate economic recovery. Terima kasih. And now I have the pleasure to invite Australia's ambassador to Indonesia, Mr. Gary Quinlan, to share his remarks. Gary, thank you for joining us today.
Terima kasih, Ibu Satu, for joining us also today. Therefore, as Ibu Satu has also mentioned, esteemed guest, next is Australian Ambassador for Indonesia, Ambassador Gary Quinlan, who will be delivering his remarks. Ambassador Quinlan, the screen is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Timothy, and terima kasih to Ibu Satu for her introduction of today's very important moment. I want to recognise, of course, Minister Sri Mulyani, who is very well known to Australia and a minister with whom we have a very long history, a very proud history of cooperation and working with her. And of course, Dr. Mari Pangestu, likewise, a very long history of association and working closely together. So it's a deep privilege for me to be able to spend this time this morning with people. Why Australia? Why me? Why am I speaking? Well, very briefly, because Australia is a very strong supporter of the World Bank and its activities in Indonesia through a special partnership which we launched this year, a few months ago, bringing together 5 previous separate funds for program activity and supporting World Bank activity in Indonesia. Indonesia to us is immensely important, and the World Bank role, impartial, professional, serious, in Indonesia is also to us a very important thing. So we're delighted to support it. The focus of our partnership with the World Bank is on human capital development, better jobs, social protection, infrastructure, and economic governance and evidence-based policy making. And we have a very long history of association with the previous version of the Indonesia Economic Prospects Report, the previous Indonesia Economic Quarterly. We also have a very well-known, very successful program on economic governance with Indonesian ministries called Prospera, which Indonesian ministries and agencies and other institutions very familiar with. And we've recently supported, for example, the public expenditure review, a very important component of economic analysis for Indonesia's future. I mean, Australia and Indonesia, I mean, we're next door to each other geographically and so on, but we're a great deal more than just being geographical neighbours. We are the 2 biggest economies in our immediate Southeast Asian region. We're both G20 partners. We're very close partners in organisations like the World Trade Organization, where Australia is very pleased to support Indonesia's leadership in trying to save the World Trade Organization and its system through reform. Both countries have just brought into effect a new economic partnership agreement on the 5th of July, which, apart from hoping that this will transform our economic relationship bilaterally, is also an important strategic economic signal about the commitment of both our countries to open and free trade and investment. And that's one of the great lessons from the Great Depression in the 1930s. We need to signal that support and then do something about that support, because there's a great fear that countries become protectionist and inward-looking in these sorts of crises. Australia and Indonesia have always worked very closely at moments of crisis like this. In the 1997-98 Asian financial crisis, which in fact generated the basis of new contemporary modern developing Indonesia. In the global financial crisis in 2008, 2009, and then in 2013 in the kind of mini crisis which arose from the unresolved elements of the global financial crisis. Today's crisis, of course, as Ibu Satu has said and reminded us, is the greatest since the Second World War, indeed from the Second World War and the preceding 1930s of the Great Depression. As President Widodo said the last few days, it is more comprehensive and more difficult economically than the global financial crisis and its predecessors. Its magnitude is so much greater. The speed with which the crisis has unwound, developed our economies and potentially our societies, the global lockdown and closure of borders, the uncertainty from week to week, because all our decision making depends on the trajectory of the virus, of the pandemic. So this makes decision making not only difficult, but it makes it existentially that much more important and powerful, because these are decisions about human lives, but the economy and the future of the economy and all our societies as a result of that. And what that means is more cooperation is needed between countries. Governments need to be more active, more bold and quick. They need the best evidence available and the best thinking possible, accepting that none of this will be perfect, that we're all learning on our way through dealing with this crisis. And this is what the inaugural Prospects Report is all about, and what forthcoming work by the World Bank, with Australian continuing support, will be all about. It's what Australia's development program with Indonesia is about. We have repivoted our development program towards supporting Indonesia's COVID response, and that will continue. All policy makers are facing some challenges in their entire professional and personal lives, and we're extremely lucky today, I think, to have people like Sri Mulyani and Mari Pangestu on this panel at this event to give us some sense of the trajectory, the way through, and what we're facing. So I really am very, very keen to listen and engage in this discussion over the next little while this morning. So enough from me. You've heard enough from me, please. We need to let the real people who can tell us something be free to comment. So terima kasih, and it's great to see people.
Terima kasih, and thank you to you too, Ambassador Quinlan. Thank you for sharing your remarks on our event today. Next, ladies and gentlemen, we will hear a taped recording of the keynote speech for today, which is delivered by Indonesia's Coordinating Minister of Economic Affairs, Bapak Airlangga Hartarto.
My dear friend Ibu Satu Kahkonen, World Bank Country Director for Indonesia and Timor-Leste, Your Excellency Mr. Gary Quinlan, Australian Ambassador to Indonesia, my colleague Ibu Sri Mulyani Indrawati, Minister of Finance, Ibu Mari Elka Pangestu, Managing Director for Development Policy and Partnership, World Bank, dear friends, honorable guests, ladies and gentlemen, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Very good morning to those joining from Jakarta, and good evening to those in Washington, D.C. I am delighted and humbled to accept the invitation from my dear friend Ibu Satu to deliver a keynote in this wonderful morning on behalf of President Joko Widodo. Although I am not physically present, I am with all of you in the spirit. I would like to take this opportunity to extend our appreciation to the World Bank Indonesia team under the leadership of Mr. Federico Gil Sander, the lead economist, who despite the challenge we all face in this difficult time, managed to deliver a timely report, the Indonesian Economic Prospect previously known as the Indonesian Economic Quarterly. This report has been sourced by many policymakers in the past and will continue to gain relevance in today's time and in the future. As the invitation to me indicates, allow me to focus remark on three areas highlighted to be discussion to be the topic of today. First is reopening the Indonesian economics. Second, policy measures that have been taken to support the economic recovery. And lastly, the required reform to achieve stronger inclusive balance, sustainable economic development. As the World Bank Global Economic Report issued in June 2020, the continuous and unhalted spread of the COVID-19 has created severe economic impact at all levels, globally, regional, and nationally. In the past few years, we have been forced to pause all economic activities, which had led to unprecedented deficiency. The correction of global growth is significant as it projected to contract sharply by minus 5.2% in 2020. For advanced economics, the contraction will stand at minus 7%. Meanwhile, the emerging market and developing economies will be experience contraction around minus 2.5%. At the regional level, the growth in Asia Pacific is likely to experience a sharp slowdown this year to 0.5%. If in the future regional supply chain recovered, regional growth is expected to climb to 6.6%. Nevertheless, we should be mindful that underlying risks that might impact our region from achieving the high growth as desired, which include, among others, sustain and emergence of subsequent wave of infection, an increase of debt and possible insolvency in some countries, mainly but not limited to low-income countries, and a slow recovery of the region economics engine such as China, Japan, and of course the Southeast Asia. Indifferent to the challenging external situation, Indonesian economic condition is also in many ways significantly impacted by the COVID-19 as well as by the global and regional economic circumstances. Indonesia is an open economy and a global player. Our economic growth is projected to decrease quite significantly from around 5% last year. However, with extraordinary policy, Indonesian economic will recover quickly. In line with the IEP reports suggest that further based on the gross national income per capita of 4,050, Indonesia is expected to be classified as an upper middle income country in the years to come. We thank you, the World Bank, for the optimistic outlook. President Jokowi has instructed the cabinet members to be in full force of reconcile the economic growth, focusing primarily on resuming the society economic cycle. After a strict mobility restriction inaugurated in March, by June, Indonesia government has started to reset the economy within the condition of new normal. This condition primarily emphasizes on resuming business activities while conforming a strict health protocols. The decision to reopen the economy has stipulated with very careful consideration. On the other hand, we need to protect the life of our citizens, while on the other, we understand the economic impact of such nation-wide restriction is sustained. Therefore, we wanted to create a right balance between health, economies, because they are like two sides of the same coin. We need to continuously ensure that those winning sectors continue to be resilient, while the other sectors suffering immensely need to be assisted so they could gradually pick up their activities, which in turn reabsorb the workforce and resume the purchasing power of the society and household consumption. To support this, we have issued Presidential Regulations 70/2020 that is the function of the legal framework for the government to increase its expenditure in the second semester this year. During the first semester, government expenditure realization it stood about 33.8% or around 668 trillion rupiah. The multiplier effect of the policy is expected to be seen as more rapid economic cycle in the society. To support the reopening, the Indonesian government continues to harmonize the fiscal and monetary policy in order to stimulate the demand and ensure the business continuously. In the beginning of June, the COVID-19 fund stood at around 43 billion, and that is part of the National Economic Recovery Program. The harmonization of the program means that the government and the central bank share the burden of financing the impact of the pandemic at the national economic recovery. In that regard, for example, we have both agreed to maintain fiscal space while keeping stability and credibility of our monetary policy, where the bank would become a standby buyer for government bond in the primary market. The allocation of the COVID-19 fund must also be well targeted as follows. $6 billion for health sectors, which cover, among others, incentive for medical staffers, COVID-19 related expenditure and tax incentive. 14 billion for social protection, allocated for cash transfer, social assistance for the Greater Jakarta and its outskirts, electricity subsidies and village fund cash transfer. US 8.2 billion business incentive that includes tax facilities. 8.47 billion is for supporting the micro and small medium enterprises, including interest subsidy, capital participation, and income tax facilities. And US 3.67 billion for corporate financing, covering primarily fund placement for labor-intensive restructures and state equity participation. And lastly, 7.27 billion for sectoral and regional transfer, which includes, among others, tourism stimulus and loan facilities. Considering the critical roles of micro, small, and medium enterprises as the pillar of our economy, we have outlined our policy measure to help them maintain productivity. First, relaxation of determination of asset quality through the enactment of Financial Supervision Agency number 11/2020. And second, credit restructuring through interest subsidy and relaxation of loan repayment. The third, low interest working capital through the involvement of state-owned bank. And fourth is the credit guarantee. As part of the National Economic Recovery Program, the People's Credit policy regarding the COVID-19 began to show result. Until the end of June 2020, there were 20 People's Credit or KUR distributors who had reported the implementation of the KUR policy related to the COVID-19. The policy implementation is in the form of additional KUR interest subsidies to 1.58 debtors, which around $3.3 billion of outstanding. Postponement of the principal installment for a maximum of 6 months to 1.5 million debtors, around $2.93 billion of outstanding, and KUR relaxation in the form of extension time to 1.52 million debtors with the amount 2.8 billion of outstanding. With those policies in place, we are hopeful that they could start rebuild the confidence and the productivity in the post-pandemic era. Another important element that cannot be decoupled from our effort to restart our economics is the Omnibus Law on job creation. With the agreement reached between the Parliament and the government, most of the substantial part, we are hoping that this legal framework will be ratified in the near future. The enactment of this law offers an opportunity for implementing a deep structural reform, and I quote the World Bank IEP report that this is a potential step in the right direction. I would like in this regard to share with you a number of strategic benefits that has been identified by government, which also will resonate the World Bank IEP report. First, it will send a strong signal to the global community on Indonesia openness for business by removing investment restriction. Is predicted that elimination of foreign equity limits, for instance, could trigger additional 6.8 billion in investment. Second, the law would improve the trading environment and increase the local companies' participation in the global and regional value chain. The third, having said above, the implementation of the law could positively influence the competitiveness and improve the rank of ease of doing business. The situation is triggered by pandemic has by and large created a momentum for economic and structural reform, for skills upgrade, for shifting business method from offline to online, and consequently strengthening digitalization of our economics and social activities. In the post-pandemic, I foresee the need for business to be more adaptive to technology transformation, IR4, and for workers to more digitally savvy. We need a reskill and upskill of our citizens to get them back into jobs. The IAP report notes labor market trends toward higher skills requirements that are likely to accelerate in the post-pandemic era. For that matter, the pre-employment card, the government is incentivizing the acquisition of skill through short-term training with more than 3,500 types of training and 246 centers. To date, there has been 1.7 million verified registered for the offline training, which will hopefully be conducted by the 3rd and 4th week of August this year. The 5 million verified application for online training and around 486,000 people has already enjoyed the benefit of the scheme. Before I conclude, allow me to once again invite the corporation, businesses, and other relevant stakeholders to utilize the facility endowed by the government for super tax deduction in area of vocational as well as in R&D centers. For companies that invest in the joint development program for COVID-19 vaccines is eligible for this incentive. Finally, I would like to note that the pandemic served a litmus test for our commitment to be working together in multilateral spirit. And I would like to invite the World Bank to continuously serve in the needs of developing countries. I would like to once again congratulate World Bank for the launch of IEP report July 2020, and I wish you all an insightful discussion. Allow me to close with 3 simple messages. Be safe, be innovative, and stay vigilant. And lastly, we always remain optimistic. Thank you. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
We thank Bapak Airlangga Hartarto for delivering the keynote speech in our event today. And next, ladies and gentlemen, we will hear the presentation of the latest World Bank Indonesia report by World Bank Indonesia lead economist Federico Gilsander. But before that, we will show you a brief video on Indonesia's latest economic situation. also would like to welcome Federico Gil-Sander, a World Bank Indonesia lead economist, on the screen with me, and he will deliver the latest situation and also the report on the latest updates on Indonesia economic challenges regarding the COVID-19 impact. And I would also like to remind you, all the viewers, that you could choose Bahasa or English on your screen and also join our talk during this event through Twitter by using the hashtag IEP Bank Dunia. Federico, it's yours.
Thank you very much, Tim. Selamat pagi dan selamat datang. Yang terhormat Ibu Sri Mulyani Indrawati, yang terhormat Pak Gary Quinlan, yang terhormat Ibu Satu Kakkonen, yang terhormat Ibu Mari Pangestu, bapak-bapak dan ibu-ibu. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Selamat pagi dan selamat datang di peluncuran laporan Indonesia Economic Prospects Juli 2020. Jalan panjang menuju pemulihan. Banyak dari bapak-bapak dan ibu-ibu yang pernah menghadiri peluncuran laporan Indonesia Economic Quarterly yang sebelumnya. Indonesia Economic Prospects adalah IEQ baru. Walaupun IEQ adalah laporan baru, namun saya tetap orang lama. Jadi, Anda mungkin menunggu saya membuat presentasi dengan bahasa Indonesia. Tapi Anda
have my presentation in Indonesian language, but as you all know, I am not smart enough to deliver an economic presentation in Indonesian language. Normally, you would perhaps wait because I used to kid around or perhaps sing an Indonesian song, but unfortunately today, my boss does not allow me to do so. I asked Pak Derek Chen. Pak Derek Chen is the head of the IAP project. Sir, permission that I need 1 hour for this presentation, and he said, no, can do. You can only have 15 minutes. And then I asked Ibu Lestari, as the head of media, permission to speak, but I would like to sing Iwan Fals song, which is about the long road. And she said, no, can do. So therefore, today, allow me to give my presentation in English. Should you feel disappointed? So blame both of them. So let's now move to the presentation. Thank you.
2020, the road to Indonesia becoming a high-income developed economy, it seemed like a long road between now and 2045, but straight. In fact, as was mentioned already, in 2019, Indonesia actually crossed the upper middle income threshold for the first time on its way to becoming a high-income economy. So it's a long road. Indonesia still had a lot of reforms to do to accelerate the growth, but it was also a straight road. And then COVID happened. And the speed had to slow down significantly as people became very scared of the virus. And this is a global phenomenon. COVID led to a major global economic shock. It started in China and it spread to Europe. And now the whole world is having to deal with the COVID pandemic. Part of what happens when there's a global economic shock, commodity prices come down. And this is very relevant for Indonesia. A lot of investments, a lot of the Indonesian economy still depends on commodities. So the negative shock on commodities is something that would have a negative impact on Indonesia. It also led to massive capital outflows. The capital outflows that were seen in March 2020 because of the shock of the COVID pandemic were some of the largest ever since the Asian financial crisis. And as you can see, what that leads to is higher bond yields, so the cost of the government to finance itself, the availability of financing becomes more scarce, the exchange rate depreciates, and that leads to volatility in financial markets. And the freezing of tourism flows. So this has been one of the main impacts that started earlier in the first quarter, when basically world travel and tourism has come to a halt, and it's still only slowly restarting even now in July. In addition to these external shocks to the Indonesian economy via tourism, via commodity prices, via global demand, of course Indonesia, as every other country, has also had to deal with the COVID pandemic, and as most other countries, Indonesia imposed mobility restrictions. And these are both because people might be afraid of actually going to shop. There is behavior to avoid catching the disease, but also most governments imposed some kind of restrictions on mobility, and this is what we see here, that in fact Indonesia did have fairly low levels of, or fairly significant reductions in mobility during the end of the first quarter and into the second quarter. And this, of course, prevents people from going to shops and shops from being open so that people can actually buy their products. And this causes a very significant impact to economic activity. And this is what it looked like in the first quarter, when we have to remember from my previous slide that in the first quarter, really only in the second half of March, we've had these mobility restrictions. For longer, we had the issues with tourism, the issues with commodity prices, the financial volatility that affected the economy earlier, but the mobility restrictions really only started in the second half of March. And what we already seen was a very significant deceleration in the growth rate of the economy. Investment decelerated significantly, consumption slowed down a lot, and if one looks at the sectors on the left-hand side, we see that a lot of the sectors that are actually very labor-intensive and that employ a lot of lower-income breadwinners, for example, the retail, transport, accommodations, which obviously is related to tourism as well, those sectors saw the largest contractions. And something to keep in mind, as we've heard Minister Airlangga mention about the skills for the new economy, the resilient sectors were actually the knowledge-intensive sectors: healthcare, education, financial sector, communication, professional services. Those sectors actually were quite resilient in the first quarter, even as the rest of the economy was hit very hard. And into the second quarter, so as I mentioned, I mean, the shock really only started in the first quarter. It intensified in the second quarter, which is likely to lead the economy to contract year on year in the second quarter. Importantly, why we care about the economy is because livelihoods depend on the economy functioning well. And livelihoods, of course, have been very severely affected, especially in those sectors that I pointed out that were more heavily hit by the economic contraction. If we look at trade, hotels, and restaurants, in the transport, storage, and communications, this is a survey that the World Bank has conducted, and it finds that 90% of those that are employed in transport, storage, and communications, right? So that's your OJEC drivers, bus drivers, they have experienced some kind of income losses. So COVID is not, it's not just about the GDP or the economy, but it's also about people's livelihoods. In response to that shock, and I think that we've heard some of the details already, the government has announced a series of fiscal packages, including additional budget for healthcare, very significant budget for social protection, as well as budgets for supporting MSMEs, SOEs, and tax reliefs for corporate. And here it's very important for us to highlight the massive expansion of social assistance that was enacted to protect livelihoods. And here you have a summary of the various programs that the government has adopted and how it has tried to expand a lot of these programs to reach people, to prevent them from that income shock that I showed in the earlier slide to translate into people falling into poverty. So where are we for the year in terms of forecasts? As you heard, our GDP growth forecast is that growth will be 0% this year. We do not expect the economy to grow, and we expect the recovery to be relatively quite gradual. So even though the base in 2020 is very low, the growth in 2021 is only expected at 4.8%, only really accelerating more meaningfully in 2022. On the plus side, the current account deficit is expected to narrow in 2020, but as the economy recovers, we expect it to be widening a little bit more. One last point on this slide is that, as Ibu Satu has explained, the 0% growth, of course, depends on what is happening now in the second half of the year with the reopening of the Indonesian economy, the relaxation of some of those mobility restrictions that I showed in the earlier slide, as well as what is happening with the global economy. So under somewhat more harsher assumptions on the global economy of a deeper contraction, and if there's a need for mobility restrictions to be reinstated going forward, we do think that the economy could actually contract by 2% in 2020. So, and this is the important point to emphasize, that without this very massive government support, under this scenario of 0% growth, under this scenario of where the economy might actually contract, poverty would actually increase quite significantly, especially if there is no additional social assistance. So without this government support, millions would actually fall into poverty, with the social assistance, if it is fully implemented and adequately targeted at those who actually need, who are actually facing the income losses, then there is a potential for the impact of the COVID shock to actually be mitigated. So it is possible, if the assistance is reaching more of those in need, to fulfill the full potential of this package, that is actually to continue Indonesia's track record of poverty reduction going forward, even with the shock. But that will require a lot of work in terms of making sure that all the people are getting the benefits from social assistance. We see that already, this is for about 4 to 5 months, already almost half of the people in the bottom 40 have received the social assistance. We hope that, as our survey, this is again from a World Bank survey, as we move forward, that that more and more people in the bottom who actually need it will be getting it to fully meet the potential of these social assistance packages. So now going to the second part of the presentation, which is on the long and winding road to recovery. This is why I had mentioned Iwan Fals. It's a jalan panjang yang berliku, namun ku harus mampu menempuh. We are where we are with the COVID. We actually started with this clear road that I showed in the beginning. But now the road has 3 sharp curves that the economy needs to handle as it moves forward and tries to get beyond the COVID and back into the recovery, back into the path towards the high-income economy. The first, of course, is the pandemic curve. People talk about flattening the pandemic curve. The government needs to deal with the public health issue. The second is this recession curve, which we've already seen in the previous part, what the shock has done to the economy and to people's livelihoods. And the third, which I think that we'll start talking about more and more as the economy recovers, the debt curve. A lot of necessary expenses have been incurred to fight the pandemic, but that means that now Indonesia has a higher debt level that it needs to deal with in the future to make sure that that the recovery is sustainable. So what needs to be done? So first, for dealing with the pandemic curve, monitoring, trace, isolating, and expand capacity, and we're going to get into details of that very shortly. In terms of the recession curve, families, firms, and banks need the cash, the liquidity, to slow their descent into recession and to allow them to restart. For the restart, regulation, skills, and infrastructure remain the key to accelerate the recovery. And to deal with the debt curve, reducing subsidies and especially collecting more tax is going to be crucial. So now let's focus on these 4 areas of policies, and let's see if this works. If this doesn't work, I will skip it. There we go. So this is the pandemic curve, which I think that you've all seen. It's in the news every day. So how do we handle this pandemic curve? And the point here is that having a robust health system that is prepared to handle the pandemic curve, whether it's new cases that come up, because this is something that we're going to have to live with to some extent until the vaccine is found, whether it's to make sure that the system can still take care of people with other kinds of needs and other kinds of diseases. This is going to be quite critical to give people the confidence for the recovery. As I mentioned in the slide on the mobility, some of the mobility is because the government tells people they cannot go, but a lot of the fact that people feel that they cannot go is because they might feel they might not have the right confidence. And so having a very strong health system preparedness response is also going to be critical to improving the confidence in the recovery. And here, 3 of the key messages in terms of what do we mean by health system preparedness. First is testing. I think that this is a mantra that we're also hearing about, both confirmatory and sample-based testing. That means that one can actually test many people to see to track the progression and the transmission of the disease and be able to quickly and very precisely act accordingly. Second is on contact tracing and isolation, which has been the key to success in many countries that handle the pandemic well. And finally, ensuring that the capacity of the healthcare system is well adjusted and can take care of everyone. So now turning to the recession curve, and I think that I was supposed to go back. Let's see if this works. It doesn't work. That's okay. So now turning to the recession curve, this is another World Bank survey with a share of firms experiencing difficulties in May and June in percent. You see that 82% of the firms experienced sales drops. And as I mentioned, this is something that is still continuing to the second quarter, and is something where there is still going to be a need for both people and firms to continue to receive some kind of liquidity support going forward. With respect to people, addressing the challenges in delivering social assistance will help families both in this kind of getting out of the recession curve part, but also going forward as part of the recovery, as part of a stronger social protection and a stronger and modern social protection system. 3 messages here very quickly. I see that my time is already exhausted. I hope I won't take too much time, Pa Derek. Dynamic database, there has been sometimes difficulty in getting to everyone. Getting the DKTS database up to speed is going to be important now for the delivery of the current emergency assistance, as well as going forward as Indonesia modernizes social protection program. Looking not only at poor households with children, but also the elderly and people living with disabilities will be important, as well as dealing with the people in the middle, the informal, the ojek drivers, the small sellers on the street who are not normally poor, but at a time like this, it's difficult to reach them because we don't know where to find them. For firms, firms across many sectors will still need help to stay afloat and then to start and restart their businesses. So helping firms keep the light on, to ensuring they have enough cash, while at the same time avoiding moral hazard, right? I mean, if the firm was already not doing well last year, it's not because of COVID that they're doing poorly. But for those firms that are doing poorly because of COVID, giving them the additional liquidity assistance and continuing to do that is going to be important. Helping firms restart or expand production, and just highlighting the fact that this needs to be a targeted approach, which again has to do with the fact that some firms are truly more likely to be hit, those that require a lot of face-to-face contact, retail, tourism, and so that kind of targeted approach of really addressing the firms that have been most hardly hit by the pandemic as opposed to firms that were already not very efficient before is going to be important to maximize the use of government resources. And then finally, this is an important point, avoiding spillovers from the real to the financial sector and deepening reforms to ensure financial sector resilience is going to be important, right? So here are, again, three messages in that regard. One, looking at how ensuring that the NPLs are properly managed. This is going to actually create a lot of financial stress for the corporate sector, and ensuring that that is adequately dealt with at the financial sector level is going to be very important. Part of that requires updating the recovery and resolution planning for banks and putting in place NPL management frameworks, including with an industry-backed resolution mechanism that is also funded by the industry. And finally, this point about minimizing moral hazard, which I also made previously, to ensure that prudential risks and risk management are maintained, because this is paramount for the medium-term soundness of the financial sector. So now moving towards accelerating towards the recovery. So these are the things to stop the slowdown into the recession and ensure that firms can then start picking up again once the economy reopening. What it will really accelerate Indonesia's progress and turbocharge this recovery are reforms to regulations, to skills, and to infrastructure. I think that we've talked a lot about the omnibus bill, that it has the potential to turbocharge the economic recovery, although we do feel, as Ibu Satu has also reflected, that some reforms could be detrimental and some pitfalls should be avoided. So the first 2 points are the kind of the key items for us from the omnibus law reform, which will really get Indonesia to a faster growth path. One is the revision of the investment law and eliminating discrimination against FDI, which will bring more investments and create more jobs, as well as the introduction of risk-based approach to import and export licensing and other trade reforms, which will definitely plug Indonesia into global value chains and also providing with a lot of opportunity for productivity growth and job creation. But the bill also includes some reforms related to the environment, to health and safety, and the incomes of Indonesians, and where perhaps dropping or modifying those reforms, if those can be reviewed, would actually ensure that the bill brings the maximum benefit to everyone in Indonesia. On the skill side, there's a great concern about school closures. They amplify the risk which already exists because of the economic shock that low-income students actually drop out of school. And I think that we've been highlighting how skills are going to be so important to Indonesia in the future. So preventing these dropouts and working with schools to prevent dropouts is going to actually have a very high impact in the medium term on Indonesia's skills based. And then beyond that, as the recovery takes hold, programs such as the Kartu Prakerja and the incentivizing of skills acquisition through short-term training, through enhancing the technical and vocational education system is going to be important so that people can actually be able to take up the jobs of the future, those more knowledge-intensive jobs that will still be around post-COVID. And finally, improving the quality of labor market information so that some of these decisions can be made with the best possible data. I'm rushing a little bit, but hopefully this presentation will be available so you can also catch on some of the details. And that's also to encourage you to read the full report. Finally, the point on infrastructure. We have been highlighting that Indonesia faces a very significant infrastructure gap. And this year, because of COVID, very understandably, some of the resources for infrastructure were redirected towards the COVID response. But going forward, increasing those public resources available for infrastructure back into infrastructure is going to be important. But as Ibu Satu emphasized, the biggest bang for the buck is really in bringing in the private sector to actually be more participating in financing and implementing infrastructure development in Indonesia. And for that, the role of recalibrating the role and incentives of SOEs is also going to be extremely critical so that you can actually have more private investment in infrastructure. Now, finally, we are talking about additional needs to spend on social assistance, that the social assistance spending is good now for the crisis, but it's also part of a modern social protection system for Indonesia into the medium term as it continues on the road to a high-income economy. We talked about the need to invest more in infrastructure. There's a continued need to maintain investments in health. But at the same time, the debt level has gone up, and interest payments have also gone up and are starting to crowd out and reduce the fiscal space. And all of this, if unaddressed, threatens the hard-earned investment grade rating of Indonesia and its macro stability, which has been a pillar of the stable economic growth. So if this is something that is not suitably addressed, it is something that would threaten the recovery. So two very quick points here on how to flatten the debt curve. First thing is that there are still some poorly targeted, environmentally inefficient subsidies to LPG, diesel, fertilizer that could be reviewed and that actually could yield significant amounts of money that could be spent on social protection as well as on infrastructure. So reallocating and eliminating these subsidies will help. But given the very significant spending needs, only tax reforms can stop Indonesia from climbing further the debt curve. And I very much like the point that Ibu Satu made, which is that no country has really ever reached high income status, have made a transition from middle income to high income with a tax to GDP ratio as low as Indonesia has, which is currently less than 10%. So increasing taxes is going to be a very central part of Indonesia's strategy to strengthen the recovery and accelerate towards a high income economy. And then here are three very concrete ideas on how Indonesia can increase tax collections, bringing more firms under the scope of major taxes, such as the VAT and the CIT. The thresholds are very high. You have a lot of firms either on special regimes or exempt from paying taxes at all. Actually having these firms, these days the technology, digitalization allows more firms to actually participate in the tax and contribute more. The notion of gotong royong, which is a very Indonesian idea that helping each other, especially in a time of crisis, to help bring down this debt curve. So that may call for raising personal income taxes, including in the middle, while also ensuring that those that have more contribute more. And finally, expanding the use of excise taxes. Excise taxes are smart taxes, tax on tobacco, plastics, sugar-sweetened beverages. They both raise revenues and they incentivize less use of these products, which are actually not very good for the environment or for people's health. So, as you can see, nga ada jalan tikus menuju pemulihan ekonomi. So I made sure that I want to conclude with one last word in Bahasa.
Recovery towards economy. I am honored to have presented the 9th edition report, and this is going to be my last IEP presentation. So that was my presentation. I would like to extend my thank you for your attention, for your friendship, and for your patience in the last 3 years. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Federico Gil-Sander, lead economist of World Bank Indonesia, for your presentation on the latest report by the World Bank Indonesia. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we will be moving on to the discussion, or the panel discussion. But before that, we would like to invite you once again to send your questions. You can do that through your screen by scanning a QR code on your screen that we have for you right now. You can scan this or also submit your questions through the Ask Question button, and you will be directed to Slido where you can give your questions or submit your questions. And you can do that right now before we start the panel discussion. Now, before we start, we are all curious of the impact of COVID-19 towards our economy, short-term and also long-term. And before we start the panel discussion, we would like to show you the current situation in Indonesia through this video.
During the survival period, it is important for the government to focus on three things. The first one is getting the pandemic under control should be the top priority. That is the reason why the government should allocate more funding for health. Secondly, because we ask people to stay at home because the social distancing program, then we need to compensate them. We pay people to stay at home, or people are paid to stay at home. So as a result, the social protection component is a very important and need to be extended not only to the poor, but also to the lower middle income group. Thirdly, it is very important to ensure that business sector will continue get the lifeline from the financial institution. And after the situation back to normal, in the sense that the government start to reopen the economy, it is very important for the government to induce the demand first. And I think this argument is also reinforced by the fact that now the loan to deposit ratio is declining. Not many companies asking for credit, because what's the point for expanding the production if the demand is not there? So the first step during the normal situation is how to induce demand. And I do believe that this could be done by providing the cash transfer, the social protection to the lower middle income group. Why lower middle income group? Because their marginal propensity to consume is relatively high. So once they get money, they're going to spend the money. And as a result, when the demand is there, the business sector will respond. By that time, it is very important for the central bank to lower the interest rate, to relax the monetary policy, including the reserve requirement. And to support business, this should be followed by the structural reform by streamlining the regulation.
Improving the targeting system, in my opinion, is one of the most important actions to ensure that this storm will fade away soon. Indonesia is a complex targeting system. It is the world's largest archipelago and fourth most populous country. The high vulnerability of poverty creates additional challenges in distinguishing the poor, the near poor, and the rich, because Indonesian poverty is very fluid with high rates of entry and exit. Developing and updating targeting system requires data collection and selection decision. There are three main lessons in improving the collection and selection method. First, use a mixed method approach to data collection. In the poorest districts, pockets of poverty, it is most effective simply to include all households, doing survey sweep. This ensures no exclusion error due to missed data collection. In other areas, use a combination of on-demand system and community nomination. Second, continue to improve proximity testing or PMT models as selection methods. Accurate and sound PMT models are at the heart of most targeting systems. Third, start to move to dynamic updating, with on-demand application along the year and graduating households along the year.
One issue that's probably worth highlighting would be the need to tread carefully on various legislative reforms. Indeed, the pandemic has breathed in a sense of crisis among many of us, such that it opens the room for policymakers to expedite reforms and revise legislation that otherwise would be difficult to push through. In the realm of Indonesia's strive to reduce dependence on external financing, I think there's an opportunity to improve or enact laws and regulations that will help deepen the domestic savings pool and minimize resident capital outflows. However, the current momentum on legislative reforms is also a double-edged sword. And if we're not careful, the reforms made now could become the foundation for future crises. A lot of policies undertaken by developed countries are now exemplified as common practice. However, we must keep in mind that for developing countries with high external dependence, not everything from the developed markets playbook will yield similarly productive results. On the backdrop of tightening fiscal space, we now see that a number of laws underpinning Indonesia's track record of fiscal and monetary policy credibility have been up for revision. Laws that in the past have been deemed sacred no longer enjoy the immunity they used to have. In this regard, we must tread carefully. Legacy fiscal rules aimed at curbing fiscal profligacy must be reinstated according to plan. Legislative revision should also not encroach too far on central bank independence, which is the backbone of macroeconomic stability in the past 2 decades.
Ladies and gentlemen, we will now start our panel discussion with our esteemed panelists or speakers. Connecting from Jakarta is Indonesia's Finance Minister Ibu Sri Mulyani Indrawati, and connecting from the States is World Bank Managing Director of Development Policy and Partnerships, Ibu Mari Elka Pangestu. Also, we would like to remind that we will have a Q&A session after the discussion. Now, you could submit your questions starting now. Please use the Ask Question icon or scan the QR code on your screen, and you will use Slido to submit the questions. Now, as the moderator of this discussion, it is my honor to further share the information of our distinguished panelists. Ibu Sri Mulyani Indrawati is the Minister of Finance of the Republic of Indonesia, who returned to this role after serving as the World Bank's Managing Director and Chief Operating Officer. Ibu Sri Mulyani has previously served several ministerial positions as the Minister of Finance, Coordinating Minister of Economic Affairs, and Minister of National Development Planning. She was also the Executive Director at the International Monetary Fund from 2002 to 2004. Our next speaker, Ibu Mari Elka Pangestu, is the World Bank Managing Director of Development Policy and Partnerships, and previously served as Indonesia's Minister of Trade and as Minister of Tourism and Creative Economy. Ibu Mari was also a Senior Fellow at the Columbia School of International and Public Affairs, as well as a Professor of International Economics at the University of Indonesia. A total of over 30 years, vast experiences in academia, second-track processes, and international organizations. I would like to welcome on the screen Ibu Sri Mulyani Indrawati and Ibu Mari Elka Pangestu. Good morning to you, Bu Sri Mulyani. And good evening, Bu Mari. Thank you for joining us all the way from the States. Okay, I hope you can hear me. We haven't heard your voice yet. Now, we'll go straight to discussions. First of all, as we see the impact of COVID-19 and measures that has been taken, it really shows impact on the livelihoods of every Indonesian. We could see it through business closures and also the loss of jobs. Now, many countries, including Indonesia, has taken exceptional assistance to try to counter these shocks. Now, my question, first of all, to Ibu Sri Mulyani is, can you tell us more about the social protection measures that the government have taken in place? And do you think that these measures should be continued all the way and implementing them until the economy fully recovers? Ibu Sri Mulyani.
Thank you very much. Very good morning to all of you. Good afternoon to Ibu Mari. I think a lot has been said and has been also explained both by Ministry of Coordinating Minister of Economic Affairs as well as the presentation by Federico. For the social protection in Indonesia, we expanded the program because of this COVID, due to exactly what's already mentioned by Federico, that COVID has already affected both the job as well as the income earned by especially the worker. And that's why for us, the first design for responding to this COVID, in addition to the health program as a priority, which we allocate 87.5 trillion, this is covering all the spending for the health, including for the medical staff, hospital, and all the medical equipment to deal with the COVID. We also expanded the social protection, which is expanded also from originally we only cover 10 million those who receive cash transfer is already expanded, and now also put the basic food support for 20 million family or targeted group. Now also expanded for about 9 million for all the family within the Jabodetabek, because that is the first epicentrum. Now the epicentrum has already shifted to eastern of Java. We also cover for non-Jabodetabek. So overall, 29 million targeted group is already covered for the cash transfer or basic food support by the government. In addition to that, we also have the electricity discount for the lowest household in Indonesia, and also the pre-working card program. We know very popular as a Kartu Prakerja, which hopefully can cover for almost 60% of the population, bottom population in Indonesia, now covered by the social protection. We also still converting some of the village fund to become the social protection by providing basic transfer to the lowest household. So these are all the social protection that we provided during this COVID. Originally, some of the program was designed only for 3 months, but now considering that this COVID will not be over until the end of the year, all this social program has already expanded until December. So for the whole year of 2020, since the beginning of the COVID, that is March until December, many of these benefits are going to be continue enjoyed by those targeted group. We do understand that this is not going to be adequate. We have to address the issue on income, and especially for the small enterprises, which is hard hit by this COVID. And that's why the program to support the small medium enterprises has become one of the priority. We've already launched, for example, the interest subsidy fund placement in the banking sector to support the working capital for the small medium enterprise, as well as capital guarantee, and also the guarantee for the non-perform loan for the small medium enterprises. The idea is for us to be able to restore back the activity, especially at the grassroots level, so that they will be able to increase the capacity to produce or have the resilience to deal with this COVID situation. In addition to that, currently, today, actually, we are still evaluating whether we are going to expand the small medium enterprises to support. But I'm going to say here that there is a package which is already put in the government regulation, which consists of all the necessary action for the government to deal with it until the end of the year. But many of the design is going to be continue, adjusted, and improved according to the challenge that we are seeing. What I'm saying, as many is saying previously or early, that this COVID is providing a very dynamic change for all of us. As a policymaker, especially, we really have to be very vigilant. So we are not going to have like one firm template ideology about how we are going to respond. We know, for example, that what is the principle of good policy to deal with this kind of situation, and the government is going to continue adjust to this area. In addition to the social protection, now we are also focusing on how we are going to help the corporation and company. So these are all the ideas that we are going to continue. And lastly, we are still in the process of structuring and designing our budget for 2021. So many of the program that is already launched in 2020, like the social protection, we are going to evaluate how much we are going to continue support in 2021 for which target of group. So this is all the area that we are finalizing, and we will continue discussing with the parliament. The budget document president will submit for this August, and we are going to continue discuss with the parliament until October. So that will give us enough time to discuss and to see which program on the social protection is effective and well targeted, and which just need to be adjusted. The discussion today, the comment is talking about the data, and we agree. I think this is the area that the government recognized that we really need to improve. The mechanism with the Indonesia autonomy and decentralization complicate the matters, because the responsibility of the local government to update this poor family and poor targeted group has not always been done in a timely manner. So when during this kind of crisis, we are not having the luxury to have an improved and perfect data. So there is always like inclusion and exclusion error. We are now asking the Ministry of Social Affairs combined with the Ministry of Home Affairs in order for us to be able to provide incentive for the local government. Ministry of Finance is also supporting those efforts. So providing all the necessary incentive or warning for the local government to be able to then update the data so that the target of those who need the support from the government can be identified and can be improved. Over to you again.
The time that this may take, as you said, that the measures have been at least planned until December, but as we know, there's no certainty on that, and we might have to go even longer than that. Now, I would like to ask, how are the further measures taken to really secure the recovery being financed in the future, noting that recovery could be long, could be gradual, and as the plans may change in the months to come?
Well, I think as the World Bank also and many other institutions who try to make a project about what is going to be the outlook of the economy, all of them is always like within those forecasts or projection have the underlying assumption. As mentioned earlier by Satu, that this assumption is based on first that the economy is going to be open, but in August, there will be no second wave, and the world economy contracting by 6 or 2%. I think we are all facing this kind of uncertainty. No one have the 100 percent confidence saying that what is going to be the outlook for the rest of the years as well as next year, especially related to this pandemic. Since this is transmitting very fast and spreading very, very fast, and each government or even locality have a different ability or willingness or also competence to deal with this kind of issue. And that's make this COVID, it can be managed in a certain country or region, but it's still going to be like spread all over the world. And that is going to be one of the most riskier because, as you know, that all this vibrant economic growth globally was built on the mobilization of the people and capital as well as merchandise, goods and services in such a very almost borderless way. And that's create what you call it growth, a vibrant growth, especially for emerging and developing country. Now, with this kind of situation, Indonesia have to really prepare for what is actually the outlook with the more optimistic and less optimistic. Of course, we all, President even asking me, what is going to be the worst case scenario? We don't want the worst case scenario to happen. And the worst case scenario is always related to how good and how effective we are going to be able to contain this virus. As well as, of course, the scenario whether we are going to have a vaccine that is going to be invented and Indonesia have the access and they have ability to produce this vaccine. So these are all the area that is going to covering and shadowing the whole projection as well as policy design for the rest of the years as well as 2021. And that's why we always put like some contingent plan within our program. First, we always like expect and hope for the best, but we also have prepare for the worst. And this is exactly what we are trying to do. First, for expect and hope for the best, meaning that we are going to see whether the indicator of the economy, especially after a very deep contraction in April and May, is going to like start to have a turning point in June and continue in July. If this is going to continue, then we are going to like hope for the best that this continued trend of the recovery is going to be maintained and sustained with the effectiveness on the health side that will not jeopardize this trend. But we also have to have a plan. What is going to happen is the people, especially the household, the lowest income household, do they have the resilience to deal with this one? Are we going to have a program to make sure that the smallest company or production that can be restored. And that is exactly what we're trying to do, to continue identifying who else and where they are. The problem is sometimes we have a good idea on a policy, but implementation is really depend on data as well as the mechanism, whether we are going to be able to reach the targeted group in a very effective way. This is not a question about, do you really know what kind of policy design that is good? We know it, but do we have all the necessary infrastructure to be able to execute those good policy design so that they are going to be able to then reach the objective that we want to achieve? This is always the challenge, especially for many other countries. I mean, for Indonesia, of course, we always have to deal with whether Indonesia people have one single identity number or ID card. This is related to Dukcapil in Indonesia. Are they actually the residents we know by name, by address? This is all another which is related to the data about the household in Indonesia. Do we know, for example, like small, medium enterprises, where they are, their location, especially those who don't have the access to the banking system? We don't know where they are, but they existed, and how we are going to reach to them. This is all the area that always become a challenge. Not that the government actually cannot identify them, but how to reach them in the most effective way is going to be very critical. Lastly, of course, with all those challenges, we also have to be very mindful, as Federico mentioned, that fiscal capacity is also not unlimited. And that's why we always have to make sure what is the priority and which area that is the policy which is effective. For example, we provide incentive on the tax incentive for many company. Almost all manufacturing sector actually offer this kind of tax incentive, whether they are tax related to the corporate tax, value-added tax. But from what we observe, not all of them enjoying that. So this is the question: are they understand, knowledgeable, informed about this incentive, or is that the procedure which is very complex? So we always have to evaluate this one, and by every month, every week actually, we are going to evaluate if a certain measure is not having a pickup or there is no traction. Then we have to be able to consider whether the design is flawed, whether we have to improve, or whether this is the wrong policy. So these are all what we call a very open, pragmatic attitude that we try to do, because there is no like one tip, one platform, one type of policy ideology with that.
Okay, my next question is for Bu Mari. Thank you very much for waiting, Bu Mari. Bu Mari, we have heard what Indonesia has done and how are the updates from Ibu Sri Mulyani as well. Now, what other measures could the government, based on your global experience, what other measures could the government take in securing the livelihood of the people in these current situations? And although the private sector is also struggling in this situation, but how could the private sector also play a role in also recovering the economy and helping the public sector?
Yes, selamat pagi teman-teman. For sharing the platform with me, Mbak Ani. I think what we have heard, the Indonesian government social assistance program and relief program, including for firms, is actually pretty much best practices, and it's what many other developing countries are also doing, and it is about immediate relief, providing it very rapidly. And in a clear way and transparent, and a lot of the features of what Indonesia is doing, for the households, cash transfer, food in kind, and other measures, as well as for the small and medium-sized enterprises and the informal sector, is all actually pretty much best practices. And what they have done, which is what all countries are doing in this pandemic relief, is to broaden and expand, as well as in some scale up, which you just heard Ani explain, that you expanded not just to the poor, expanded other households to broaden it, because we know pandemic is having impact not just on the poor households, but the near poor, even the middle income, they're all being affected. And firms, many of them small and informal, they're very hard to capture. And sometimes it is with broad household support that you can actually address the more informal sector. So in that sense, I think Indonesia is already doing all the right approach. I think the only thing is exactly what was already said by Ani, which was, we are in uncharted territories. We have to be flexible. We have to be adjusting as the situation develops. And she mentioned data, and I think it's the key point, because to the extent that you have data, you are able to target better, and you're able to address the pockets of population that need it the most. And so developing the type of data that is needed to be able to better target is maybe something which I know Indonesia is doing, as she explained, the social, the data coming from the social data registry on the poor households is being updated, consolidated, and this needs to be improved. And the second thing I would say is that the data will not only help you to better target, but to also monitor whether what you are doing is achieving and what it should be doing and reaching those that are needing it and is effective, right? So the other component of the data is to try to make it as digital as possible, including in the delivery of this, which I believe Indonesia is doing in some instances, not in all instances. Because this is, I think, if you think about the potential, and this is the idea of crisis opportunity, even though you do not have digital ID yet, you can probably start having a digital ID for parts of your population and start building up a database way. And it can serve many purposes, including for the tracing and the containment for the health part. It can also serve for the relief part. It can also then later on, when you are trying to give assistance, not just social assistance, but also micro lending, learning skills, upgrading, education, delivery, health delivery. It can be providing a platform for future delivery of other assistance. So I think that would be the thing that I would add, and I say this to all countries, that data is important and you need to develop it as you are developing these systems and social assistance. And second, as much as possible, develop the digital platforms. And here's actually where the private sector can play a role. So you asked the question about what can the private sector do. I think the first thing the private sector can do, and this depends, of course, on the type of firms. The private sector is not homogeneous. For the firms who are employing large numbers of workers, especially the labor-intensive firms, as much as possible, they should undertake layoffs. And this is where some of the government programs of wage subsidy and some debt suspension programs or debt relief programs that are coming through the banking system can help big firms to not lay off. So the assistance is conditional upon them not laying off people. And some firms have also become very innovative. As you know, some government firms have repurposed their production to make protective. In Indonesia, in Bangladesh, we have examples of that. And firms are involved in the supply of goods or delivery of public services, essential public services, whether it's medical, whether it's food. These are also firms that, with government support, they can be public-private partnership. Other, regulatory issues that ensure the flow of goods, essential goods are able to flow, as well as giving support and ensuring that they continue to function, because this is also an important part of the health as well as the economic response. And the last thing I think that private sector can do, this goes to the innovation and the digital component again, that firms, we actually have seen firms being able to respond, including those who are what we call gig workers, those working from home. that this is just data from the pulse surveys that the World Bank does, that firms are embracing technology to help mitigate the effect of the shock. Some 20 to 40% of firms are starting to use or increasing the use of internet, online social media, special apps, or digital platforms for business purposes, while another 30% are investing in new equipment or software. So this is, I think, another thing that the private can do to repurpose and start responding and start developing new business models. And private sector firms who are involved in the e-commerce world and those who have data, they can also share with the to be able to think about how to deliver some of the social programs as well as to deliver social assistance or programs to the informal sector as well as the SMEs. You can take, for instance, e-commerce platforms that do have a lot of vendors who are SMEs, or the object drivers who are in these platforms. Have other ways that we can empower them more and so on. So and these are what type of assistance would you be able to provide to these SMEs and micro enterprises and so on. I think those are just how you can involve the private sector, the government in the relief stage as well as in the recovery stage.
Thank you, Bu Mari. Bu Mari and also Bu Sri Mulyani, my next questions will be coming from the audience. We will be opening the Q&A session right now. We have received a couple of questions from the audience who have sent or submitted their questions through Slido. I will read to Bu Mari and also Bu Sri Mulyani the questions. I will have it on my screen. I am still receiving these questions through Slido. And as we wait for the questions from the audience, it would be also interesting later on to know how the audience has taken the explanations given also through the report from the World Bank and from the explanations from Ibu Sri Mulyani as well as also Pak Erlangga Hartarto. Now, I have questions here on my screen now. My first question would be, or is, for Ibu Sri Mulyani. Oh, sorry, it is for Ibu Mari. The first question is for Ibu Mari from Andre Suryatna. I'll read you the question, Bu Mari. The first question is, being upgraded to upper middle income category seems to diverge with the idea of increased poverty predicted post-COVID-19. Now, does this indicate widening inequality? This is for you, Bu Mari.
Yes. I think it's not necessarily related. I think the fact that Indonesia was upgraded to upper middle income country is the calculations that were done prior to COVID, and you have just entered into the upper middle income country. It's about per capita income, basically. And poverty and inequality are measured not necessarily related to the per capita income, if you like. And we can expect poverty increase because of the pandemic. And this is for Indonesia, obviously, but all countries, we are expecting an increase. In fact, the World Bank is estimating something like 73 to 100 million people will be increasingly entering into extreme poverty. Inequality has improved, actually. We don't know post-COVID, of course, but prior to COVID, last year's numbers are showing improvement in the Gini in the case of Indonesia. Now, COVID, again, we expect that there can increase in inequality. And this is not just for Indonesia, just because it impacts the poor and the vulnerable more, so their ability to respond is much lower than the higher incomes, obviously. And it's not just an income issue. Certain groups are more vulnerable. Women, especially, are more vulnerable in the effect of the COVID, as well as in some of the tend to not women. So what I'm trying to say is that for inequality, for us to focus now is really making sure that we prevent the numbers of being impoverished to be as minimum as possible, and address and acknowledge that poverty is to increase. So we need to make sure our policies, our policy responses are going to be tuned to making sure that the inequality is not going to happen with the pandemic. So I'm just let me know that you need to make sure that the impact is different between men and women in COVID. We know this from all the empirical information of the World Bank experience from past crises. Even like education, kids are not going to school, and when they go back to school, a lot of times less go back to school, for instance. So we've got to make sure that our policies is, or otherwise the inequality in terms of gender, and you will find similar examples for income as well as between different in society. So I'll just stop my answer there.
The next question is for Bu Sri Mulyani. I'll read you the question, Bu Ani. How might the move of banking supervision back from Bank Indonesia, back to Bank Indonesia from OJK, and the addition of unemployment to Bank Indonesia's mandate impact investor confidence in Q3 and Q4?
Well, we haven't make anything substantial on that, so I think that is more a speculative question. Whether the government as well as the parliament is going to decide in terms of the architecture, financial supervisory as well as a monetary authority, it's really depend on what is the legislation process which is going to happen in the second half. I think what is most important is the message that the government as well as Bank Indonesia, OJK are committed to make sure that the stability of the financial sector continue maintained and safeguarded because we are facing a very challenging situation at this moment. Many of the company as well as bank will definitely face a very strong pressure coming from the downturn of the economy, and that's why we are going to implement many policies to ensure that the resiliency of the company as well as the financial sector, whether this is bank or non-bank financial institution, are going to be able to survive. And many of the message about that we have to be very careful while we are deploying many of the policy, but at the same time we have to be make sure that there will be no moral hazard. It's something that we are fully, and that's why many of the discussion of the policy as well as the implementation continue involve or engage with the law enforcer institution so that they are fully aware about what kind of decision and design that we are discussing and where the trade between what the policy to protect as well as support the business as well as the bank that cannot be interpreted as actually the support for the wrongdoer or wrongdoing which is committed by either company or banking system. So it's always find the right balance. I think Indonesia learned a lot. So I want to assure for you, the audience, the government really working with Bank Indonesia, OJK, LPS, with the according to the law to maintain the stability. If there is a flaw or weaknesses or inadequacy in the regulatory framework that we are, as well as what we've already put on a agency law, on a law number 2/2020, we will continue to try to improve with same understanding that the focus of all of us try to make sure that the people as well as the business and the financial sector, they are going to be able to withstand shock and even survive and recover. So these are all the focus that we are doing. Anything else actually the derivation or derive from those kind of priorities.
Our next question from our viewers is for Ibu Mari. The question is, what are the key sectors where Indonesia has genuine competitive advantage in this new global economy? Ibu Mari.
Well, I think it's still, you have a large domestic market, you have a young labor force, so I would say labor-intensive sectors, hopefully your skill level, would still provide opportunity for Indonesia, and I think sectors that are related to using innovation, and it's not just digital technology, but innovate across the board. Because I think what Indonesia is going to face moving forward, and something that we actually were already facing before it happened, was diversify our economy away from being commodity based. We talk about this all the time, and so always been about, okay, how do we upgrade our manufacturing sector? How do we use innovation, increase what are the productivity drivers for the Indonesian economy? So it is manufacturing, but I also think agriculture, we need to pay attention to increasing the productivity in our agriculture sector. And I would say service. This is something that I've thought about for a long time in my 30 years of experience with Indonesia. I think the services sector also a big potential for Indonesia. Right now, the services sector is the largest employer, but it is more in the traditional low-end service, construction and trade. Whereas I think especially now, we probably have opened up the opportunities for more modern services, business consultancy, e-commerce based, digital based services. These are all going to be potentially coming up. The issue will be the human capital, as we all know, and infrastructure, and making sure your economy remains open. And here, I think issue about reforms, about being able to investment, keeping your economy open. These will be key issues. The three reform areas that Satu mentioned, these would be key to allow the transformation in Indonesia to happen and allow these sectors and the productivity drivers in these different sectors to come about. And I think in manufacturing, we do, need to think about how do we be competitive to serve the domestic market as well as to export. And the final thing I would say, just because you related to COVID, there's a lot of issue now about food and about being more self-reliant because the crisis showed that the vulnerability of being reliant on certain medical suppliers and so on. And the tendency is, okay, let's make everything ourselves. But this is probably not the right way either to do it. The way to do it is to diversify, and to the extent that you can manufacture, yes, but it has to be competitive. Otherwise, you are going to be really having a disadvantage for your own consumers in terms of access. And I think that the last thing I would say is that remaining open is going to be important for Indonesia. And here is where Indonesia needs to be part of the global value chain is going to emerge. We are doing a lot of work in this area now. A lot of the transformation was already happening before COVID, as we know, because of the trade tensions and so on. There's already been a lot of relocation and readjusting, and we think this is going to continue. And Indonesia needs to be part of that emerging global value chain or regional value chain that's going to emerge. And here is why openness is important. Ambassador Quinlan mentioned the recently signed Australia-Indonesia Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement. I'm very happy to see it finally get implemented. I did start negotiations, I think it was about 10 years ago. And that seems the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership of East Asia, which is the 16 economies, 10 ASEAN, China, Korea, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and it should have India in it. India is not quite there yet, but this is a much larger market. than ASEAN per se. So this is opportunity for increased access to markets, increased size of market, increased regional value chain. And I think we need to position ourselves well in there and issue the investment. And that's why the reforms that were mentioned are very key and important. It's the investment climate issue. It has always been one of the big issues. And barriers, the SOE reforms, and I thought that obviously policy is also sustainable. So the macro policy stability in the picture is also very important to attract investment. I'll stop there.
Despite the uncertainties provided by COVID, it's refreshing to hear the opportunities that you have told us, Bu Mari, and also to know that the government is doing its best and being very fluid in strategy every week, as Ibu Sri Mulyani has also told us today. I would like to thank Ibu Sri Mulyani Indrawati, the Finance Minister of the Republic of Indonesia, for joining today. Ibu Sri Mulyani, thank you very much for it. And also Ibu Mari Elka Pangestu, Managing Director of Development Policy and Partnerships of the World Bank. Bu Mari, thank you very much for your time with us today, and thank you for joining us midnight from the States. Bu Ani and Bu Mari, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, we are approaching the end of our event today. Now, I would like to remind you that the report can be downloaded. So you can download the report. The website is on your screen on the left side where you could see, you could download it at www.worldbank.org/IEP. And also the latest information on World Bank can be followed through our Twitter account at Dunia. Now, for our journalist friends, the press conference will be held right after this part of the event ends. Therefore, we will hold a press conference right after this immediately. And you could join by pressing the press conference icon on your screen. Now, I would like to thank everyone involved in our event today. And thank you for your attendance and for viewing our event, the launch of the newest World Bank Indonesia report. My name is Timothy Marbun, and I'll see you in our next IEP event.